Dr. Passos Ferreira is, as I mentioned, she's a professor of bioethics at New York University. She studied psychology at the Rio de Janeiro State University and earned her MA and PhD in the program of Human Sciences and Health Sciences in Public Health. She obtained a second PhD in philosophy at the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. And she's published in philosophy, psychology, and neuroethics, and worked as a clinical psychologist and collaborated in cross-cultural research on moral development and social cognition. And her current research program focuses on the development of consciousness, including what theories of consciousness say about infant consciousness and machine consciousness, and how these theories shed light on ethical issues. So really pleased that she was able to come along here. And she's going to tell us something about her ideas, and then we'll have a chance for a discussion. So Dr. Passos Ferreira, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Should I say tonight? Because here in New York, it's still afternoon, but I think in Access is evening. So thank you very much, and thank you for this very nice introduction. It was a pleasure to participate in this collection organized by John. And I think maybe just as a matter of introduction, it's good to situate this work in my trajectory. So this chapter was a kind of summary of a book I published in Portuguese, and this book was based on my master thesis that before I became a philosopher. I had a previous degree that was in public health, but connected to mental health, and was an interdisciplinary project. My group was based in Rio with psychologists, philosophers, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, and the idea was to understand Freud, the Freudian mind. This was my attempt when I started this project, and I thought the idea of mental causation and how psychic conflict causes symptoms was like a central thesis in Freudian theory, and I decided to explore different pictures Freud offers in his work around the psychic conflict causing mental states. So yeah, I want to give this introduction because the field changed a lot. And the way I see the connection between this past work on mental causation and Freud is it helps us to see the challenges that Freud was facing when he was trying to connect the mind and the body. And I think highlights why some new theories or new options emerge in the field in attempt to solve some problems that Freudian theory was facing. Okay, so I think this chapter plays this role to helps us to understand how Freud tried to explain how a mental event causes another mental event in the mind, how the psychic conflict causes bodily changes, symptoms, dreams, and other types of mental states. And faced with this problem, how the changes in the theory can reflect this first challenge that Freud had in his theory. Okay, so as everyone had access to the to the chapter before, I thought I would just give some like general summary what I'm trying to do in the chapter, and then move to discussion and see what are your thoughts and your questions about my ideas in this chapter. Okay. So I think as Zoom, the slides occupies the entire screen, I thought it was better not use a slide. So I just go through my notes, but feel free if there is any clarificatory question while I'm going through my notes, feel free to interrupt me. If you have a more substantial questions about my ideas, we can go for those questions in the Q&A. But any clarificatory question, just you can feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so the paper, as I said before, was based in a book I published on the topic of Freud and mental causation, and this chapter summarize two central ideas I discuss in the book, and how those two Freudian central ideas are connected in the explanation of how psychic conflict can cause a mental state. So one idea is this idea that there is a cause, okay? So either a clash of representation, a clash of narratives, or unconscious representations, two different parts of the mind, the unconscious and the pre-conscious conscious part of the mind, and how this conflict between either two systems or between representations or between two drives might cause symptoms, or might cause a defensive mechanism that might cause some symptoms. You can also add an extra layer of causation. You have a conflict, you have defensive mechanism that might be involved in the conflict, and you have, as a result, either symptoms or bodily changes or strange actions that the subject perform to deal with the basic conflict. Okay, and the other central idea is the division of the mind. Okay, that permeates all Freud's work. Okay, so either those representations are in a clash, that are clashing one system and cause a defensive mechanism in another system, or both systems are in clash, the conflict a result of a clash between two systems. But the idea of that there is a division of the mind is relevant, is central. And the three versions of mental causation I try to extract from Freud's work have those two components as relevant elements. So far, I'm just saying things that we all are very familiar with, and I think the most interesting contribution might be how I see those two hypotheses as a central element for how Freud understands mental causation, and why I think I try to offer three versions of how he explains mental causation in his work, and why I think the last version is the most successful. Okay, anticipating some of my thoughts on this. Okay. Okay, so one problem that Freud faced when he was trying to understand mental causation, how one event can cause a mental event, was the problem of how the mind and the body interacts. Okay, and one attempt for him to solve this problem, because some of the one thing is a clash of representations. The other thing is a conflict, a psychic conflict that will reflect in some changes in the body. Okay, so how does mental event interact with the physical event and cause that physical event? And this is central for Freud because he wants this to be the explanation of what he was seeing in his clinical work. Okay, so faced with this, he thought he would need to explain physical processes, but also explain mental processes. Okay, so you can see in his work a tension between some room for scientific explanations, but also some room for mental explanation or psychological explanation. Okay, and he faced a relevant criticism regarding this tension in his work, regarding the fact that these two notions of causes, one is a physical notion, another one is a psychological notion, they reflect different explanations in science. Okay? So the physical explanation usually will go together with some laws of physics that explain why a physical event in the brain causes another physical event in the brain. The mental explanation or the causal explanation that is related to psychological explanations are related to generalizations. We don't think that we have psychological laws that can explain what's going on in the mind of the patients. Okay, so in the attempt to explain how the body and the mind interacted, Freud ended up creating this kind of hybrid approach, where in one level he was working with some physical explanations and trying to find some laws that could explain this. And in the high level, he was facing the problem of how to explain some psychological facts about his patients, and how physical laws could not explain those facts. So when we are dealing with the patients, we know that each patient, we explain the cause of their symptoms in a very idiosyncratic way. So you cannot generate a law that would be applied to all patients, okay? So facing a threat or a danger, one patient will react with a sequence of actions, and another patient will react with a completely different sequence of actions. We can all agree that the cause was, in both patients, was probably a threat to their psychic system, but the effect of that cause will be very idiosyncratic. And even in a patient, you can sometimes find some generalizations. So these patients usually will react with X and Y symptoms facing anxiety or a threat to their psychic system, or in a way to defend themselves to a conflictive representations. But even those generalizations in one patient sometimes failed, because sometimes patients can surprise us, create a new symptom in reactions to a similar threat they have in the past. So one thing is to understand what caused that mental state. And Freud, he wanted that mental state had a cause. He didn't want to be a random reaction or something that was completely accidental. He wants to explain and give a cause to that event. But in attempt to give a cause, he was facing with this problem. Should this cause be explained as a physical explanation, trying to find brain or neurophysiological explanations to that cause? Or should I explain this cause in a psychological level? That means a level that we cannot use physical laws or psychological laws. we use generalizations to generate predictions, but those are generalizations and not laws. So I think the best way to understand this dilemma is use Donald Davidson's approach and how we understand causes, and how he gives us a framework that you can understand cause in the physical, as a physical cause, but also as a mental cause, okay? So his idea is, one thing is understand the event as having two components or two descriptions. So you have a physical event that can be described mentally or can be described physically. And if you describe mentally, you not generate physical laws, you just have generalizations. If you describe that event physically, you can find physical laws that can explain the event. One problem for Freud theory is that for Freud, just going back a little bit to Davidson, then you understand the comparison with Freud. For Davidson, what was the interaction, or at least his attempt to understand the metaphysics of the mind, was to postulate events. So I have a physical event in the brain, a neurophysiological event, or a neuron that will fire, and that electroactivity can be described as a physical event in the brain, or can be described as a mental event. Okay, the description regarding mental events, as I said before, will generate psychological explanation. The description regarding physical events will generate physical explanation of how the brain works. Freud, he has the problem because he was not thinking about events. He was thinking about apparatus. So he was trying to create a connection between the mental apparatus and the neurophysiological apparatus, and how those two apparatus would connect together. And this posed a completely different problem. And I think all the hybrid vocabulary that he created was because he was trying to understand those two causes, not as an explanation about an event, but as an explanation that would connect two different, in Freud idea, not two different, because I think he has a kind of materialist approach, trying to see how we could use the mental apparatus to explain what was going on in the neurophysiological apparatus. And this generates lots of problems because for him, the way to connect those two apparatus was to try to find intermediaries between those two apparatus. And this brings to the picture a complication. And the intermediary would be the drives, okay? How sexual drives or drives related to life and death can excite the system in a way that will cause mental change in the mental apparatus, okay? Okay, just to give this a general introduction of, I think if you understand Freud's idea with the framework of events might be helpful. And this is the reason in the paper I try to bring Donald Davidson's approach to the picture, because I think he has an attempt, maybe you can see Freud in the similar, regarding the metaphysics of the mind, in the similar field, or at least in the similar side that Donald Davidson tried to give a non-reductionist description of the mind, where physical events have an important role, but also mental events cannot be completely reduced to those physical events, okay? Okay, so this is just to give you an idea why I thought Donald Davidson's approach could be a useful approach. So one way in the history of psychoanalysis, the contemporary history of psychoanalysis, one way to understand this tension between the physical apparatus and the mental apparatus, the neurological apparatus and the mental apparatus. Historically, some some theorists, some psychoanalysts try to understand this division either as we should either save one approach or save the other approach. Okay, so we have in the history of psychoanalysis those that think the best part of psychoanalysis is understand psychoanalysis as an interpretative or a way to understand or to generate psychological explanations about the mind. And some others that think, no, there is something relevant in the attempt to naturalize this mind and come with some neurophysiological descriptions of the brain that might help us to understand. Okay, but I think more recently, those that try to preserve the naturalistic force of Freud, of the Freudian unconscious, and try to keep lively Freud's idea that there is a biological force in the mind. I think they have to change a little bit or introduce some changes in the theory to accommodate better these connections between the mental apparatus and the physical apparatus. I have in mind, and I cite in the paper, in the Braco and in Mark Solms, two examples of an attempt to revive this biological description. In the case of Linda Braco, the biological mechanism. In the case of Mark Solms, the neuroaffective conscious feelings as the connection between the mind and the body. Okay, but this is just a big introduction, what I think Freud was facing and how I think this reflects in his what I call three versions of a mental causation, okay? And I will go now for briefly describe those three moments on Freud's work to explain mental causation. Just important caveat, I'm not a Freudian scholar, so probably a scholar might find either more descriptions of more moments in Freud's work that I just highlighted 3 moments. I have no pretension that this would exhaust all Freud's attempts to describe the psychic conflict as a mental causation. And also, an important caveat is maybe one of those attempts collapse to another. Maybe a scholar might say, oh, we just have actually two mental, either more than the ones I describe or less than the ones I describe, trying to see the connections between one and another. But I thought as a matter of approaching the topic, I thought it was interesting to highlight that some particular changes that I thought was relevant for my main thesis in the paper. That is the idea that the last theory of mental causation, theory maybe, or at least the last explanation he has, is the most successful one, because he gives a full intentional or psychological explanation of the event of the mental causation that I think avoids some of the problems he had before. Okay. So the first, I'll just go very briefly through those 3 moments. The first is the first topography, the unconscious, preconscious apparatus. And I call this first approach the hybrid topography. I think is where Freud was facing most problems in his theory. So the idea is you have like an unconscious system, a repressive system. And so when you see how Freud is trying to explain the repressive system, you see that he has a hybrid vocabulary try to explain. One vocabulary is a kind of neurophysiological vocabulary about excitation. The system has an energy that changes, and that changes in the systems will cause some changes, some mental changes. And together with this explanation is go together also kind of a psychological explanation, all the fantasies that he brought to describe, for instance, a case of phobia or compulsive action. So this, I call this a kind of anticipatory system because what is relevant for me is how he describes the ego as this kind of system that either will react to changes, changes in excitation, changes in energy in the system, or either will react to changes in the meaning. Okay, so fantasies is about meaning. There is some semantic component that is relevant. And the energy has a kind of neurophysiological component, okay? And he creates a very complicated apparatus to try to connect those two different levels of registration of information. One information is a physical information, the other information is a mental information. And you have two different levels of two different concepts of information. If you understand energy and meaning as a type of information, that Freud is trying to understand this anticipatory system as reacting to both, okay? So I think this creates a very complicated topography that we see that how Freud faces many problems there. I will want not go back to those problems, but those problems helps him to move to the second topography, okay? That I call the intentional topography, where he's faced with one problem that motivates him to change the design of the theory, okay? So, and this the problem is the idea that we have unconscious feeling of guilty, okay? So if you have unconscious feeling of guilt, it's a kind of feeling that is not just an energy, but is already a component that has already some meaning as part of this mental state. Okay, no one can feel guilty if they don't have an understanding or psychological understanding of a kind of complex interaction in our lives. Okay, so neurons don't feel guilt, persons feel guilt. So you need a completely different apparatus to understand this. And this is what he does. He develops this different apparatus, the ego, id, and superego, where parts of the ego can be conscious or unconscious. He changed a little bit the dynamic of those systems, but he still keeps in a low level description some neurophysiological descriptions of the mind, that is the instinctual drives, okay? So although the unconscious desires cause feelings of guilty, in this second topography, the unconscious desires are still caused by instinctual drivers. So we still have like an excitatory physical changes that will cause the unconscious desires, okay? And these excitatory unconscious, these excitatory instinctual drives, they are what I call irrational causes. They are causes that needs to be described as a physical cause and not as a mental cause. And in the last part of his work, he introduced anxiety as a feeling that can describe all the mental causation and the way the mind will work. Okay, and I think this is the more compelling version, but also the most coherent version of his theory. Okay, the idea that we have a feeling, anxiety, that causes changes in the system. Okay, anxiety is a psychological reaction okay? There is a signal of danger that causes fear and causes the systems to feel this anxiety. It's a kind of mental reactions, and it's not just an energy or a brutal force that make changes in the system, okay? And what is interesting about this explanation is once Freud described anxiety as the mental force that will cause changes in the system, they created this completely intentional system that does not need anymore the physical force to explain the changes that happens in the system, okay? So an intention system that reacts to danger with an affective state, and anxiety is this mental cause that will modify intention actions of the ego. Once we isolate one mental event, we can understand that probably this, if you go back to Davidson, you can understand anxiety as a mental event that has a physical component. And explanations about the brain can understand in a different level, can give us an understand of how this event and anxiety can be connected to some changes in the brain. But then the changes in the brain will be explained in a completely different descriptions. For instance, nowadays you have all this description, all the descriptions related to the computation of the brain that might help us to understand probably what are the physical changes that might be connected to changes, psychological changes as anxiety in the system, okay? Okay, I'll stop here. I think I have already said too much. So I think what we have, I think might be enough for trigger some discussions in the group. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. I suppose a question I had might seem irrelevant because you say that the mental conflict divides the mind. Could you say something about the original conflict or the origin of conflict? How is it described in Freud?
Yeah, I don't think it is irrelevant. I think it's a very relevant question. So maybe you can think about the original conflict as something that will. So when the subject develops, this might be at least something that might be connected to first later in development to the emergence of some defensive mechanism. Okay, you can think about maybe the conflict. We have like original conflict that is can think about a mind that develops with some tension that will be resolved later in development. Okay. Otherwise, you can think, and Freud, I think, has this idea that we start with this kind of unconscious mind with a very thin layer of perceptual interactions with the environment, that is the ego. And just later, this ego get a more robust existence in the mind or become a more robust structure in the mind, okay? And you want to have like two different parts of the mind, you can understand that probably any conflict in the unconscious or in the id will create some kind of defensive mechanism in the mind, okay? So the first conflict not necessarily is dividing the mind, probably is causing, probably will develop with we have some kind of period where we just live with some conflicts without causing necessary defensive mechanisms. Probably defensive mechanisms entering the picture a little bit later in the mind, when probably the ego develops some memories or get a more cognitive or at least develop some cognitive process, at least to understand, to have some better understanding of how some representations might be in danger or fear. Okay, and if you think about the last topography or the last explanation, where the revised theory of anxiety. So the anxiety is already present in the first stages, okay, as a feeling of hopeless, okay. So probably to become a conflict, you need a little bit more of development of the ego. But you're right that maybe some conflicts in the beginning are not immediately causing. Maybe the primary conflict will not cause immediately a divide of the mind. Okay? What is your view on this?
Well, I don't know. It seems to me
because I know I'm talking with a specialist, so all your views on this are very relevant for me.
No. Okay. I mean, the mental conflict divides the mind into conscious and unconscious parts. I mean, that seems like a big bang, right, of the mind somehow, that there's conscious and there's unconscious. So I just, trying to imagine what happens to reconstellate the person into having a conscious and an unconscious. I don't know how that happens, but
yes, I think there is one picture of Freud's view that this division, that we would have like we are born with the unconscious as a kind of reservoir of a kind of different drives. But I still think that when you think about the repressive mind and all the defensive mechanisms, this division, I think, can be easily explained by the idea of psychic conflict, okay, as something that created this repressive mechanism, as something that I don't want. Either I don't want to become conscious, as I don't want to, as I can be something that I don't want to come to my consciousness, or a traumatic event that I want to get out of my memories. Okay, so when Freud is trying to explain the traumatic, the trauma, I think he has a clear picture that conflict created this specific mechanism of the defensive mechanism that will divide the mind. But you can think about our existence as we might be developed with a kind of unconscious system that is not in the beginning in constant conflict with an ego that is still developing, or kind of conscious part that is still developing. Okay, we need some kind of censorship to enter in the system to understand some of the drives of the system as something that would cause some danger, or something that I have to repress because is traumatic. Okay, so maybe the unconscious and a conscious in the first 2 years of our development might be less, this division might be less prominent than when we develop our defensive mechanism. Okay, but this discussion about the origins, because one thing is the description of an adult mind and what's going on with an adult or a child, a 5-year-old child that have read this kind of structure Freud has in mind. But when you think about the origins, you're right, might be conceivable that we start with a less divided mind that becomes divided later, okay? Probably you have less conflict. Probably those drives are, or all those instinctual drives that Freud described are part of our mental apparatus, creating less conflict, okay? We first have to have a conflict for this division of the mind be more explicit or become more crucial. Okay.
It's
But
interesting.
I'm happy to hear other views on this.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing and then someone else come in. I mean, it's interesting to speculate, right, that does this original stimulus come from within, or does this original stimulus, is it the impact of the outside world? So, you know, it could be that within the original mind itself, there are forces or tendencies that begin to germinate, if you like, and divide the mind. Or it could be that the mind is a kind of unity, and then it's the encounter with the world in whatever way that creates this kind of division. It's just something to play with there.
Yeah, I have a more pluralistic picture. I think both stimulus might be present in the beginning. I think in the beginning, you can imagine an infant with a level of anxiety that they cannot, that comes from internal sources. Okay, imagine a source of pain or any kind of discomfort or displeasure that the infant does not know how to relieve. And you can think about threats from the environment. Okay, I think both things are present in the beginning. Okay, probably the internal source. If you have a very well-protected environment, probably the internal sources are more relevant. If you have a very dangerous environment or not safe environment, a not a reliable mother, or environment that is full of tensions, you can see that infants might react can see impacts of this in a non-reliable environment in the way infants develop or at least learn how to deal with their anxiety. So I think both things in the last picture of the revived theory of anxiety, Freud he thinks that anxiety might be a reactions to both internal sources and external sources. And I like this picture.
Right. So someone else who has a thought? Barbara, you're muted.
Okay, good.
There you are.
Okay, there I am. You know, the idea of origins is there's one thing that you've written here, looking at this as a hypothesis that works like a mythical cause, offering a new repertoire for causal explanations to justify why we perform certain actions. That reminded me of Roland Barthes, who said, it's myths all the way down. So, and when you're looking for something causal, you're going to find another myth.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know very much about Roland Barthes, so maybe whatever I say will be very naive. But what I have in mind here, and maybe I'll say a little bit what I have in mind, and maybe see if I can get a connection with the idea that it's myth all the way down. I like this metaphor. So one way to understand this is, so Freud has this, okay, how the conflict might start with the Oedipian complex, okay? So have Oedipian complex, have a conflict there, and I think would be very hard to find the Oedipian complex in the brain. So the brain is not reacting to Oedipian complex. Brain probably reacting to something else. But I think the Oedipian complex tells us about primary fantasies that might be part of the conflict. And this might be an interesting myth to understand psychological explanations. But I think if you try to find, okay, there is Oedipian complex in the brain that explain changes in our excitatory system, I think it will be very hard for this. Nowadays, if you think about computation explanation, they explain much better how anxiety might be disturbing brain interactions, okay, than the explanation of, for instance, the Oedipian complex. One thing you can say, okay, so the way computation, maybe Roland Barthes would say computational explanation is another myth. That is, we are created to explain the brain. Maybe it is, but it seems to explain the brain, it's more, it seems explained better than understand the brain as reacting to an Oedipian complex. But you can still have an Oedipian complex as a psychological explanation for us as a persons or individual, what might cause us be part of our primary fantasies and might cause some psychic conflict, okay? And how we can explain how this impacts our development, and how some conflict and defensive mechanisms are related to this this kind of original myth that Freud gave to us. Okay, so this is what I have in mind. I think this kind of myth is very hard to be implemented when we're trying to understand the neurophysiology. And Freud tried a lot to understand the neurophysiology as dynamics related to death and life, or sexual drives, and how those sexual drives could be connected to for instance, the Oedipian complex. So I think this is what I had in mind. But maybe you can say a little bit more what you think. And
yeah, now when you bring up implement, I think that's an interesting way to come into this. And that's where I'm missing from Freud the social element, because like it used to be said, that a baby exists, and then we've said, babies don't exist. There's only a dyad, mother and baby. And I think we could maybe also include this in this idea of the mind-body. The mind-body is always in an environment, and it's a social environment. So I'll just, I'll just add a few things of what I've liked about the article. There's here this, the vocabulary of folk psychology is capable of producing generalizations with a reasonable predictive capacity although it does not allow regimentation into laws. Well, I thought, yes, that's good. But then I go ahead and I think about, well, what is actually folk psychology? And then I don't find it in what is being said later. I don't consider what's being said later folk psychology, because folk psychology, as far as I understand it to be, is very, very concerned with the social.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. And so you're right that I didn't try to cover the social element in this piece. It is not because I don't think is a very relevant part of how our mind works. And I think maybe in the intention topography, the second part, how the superego develops with interaction with figures of authority, so the social or parental figures, the social entering the picture, and in the final revised theory of anxiety, all our relations with the environment and how the environment, how anxiety might be not just reactions to internal source, but reactions to environmental source, the social enters in the picture. That said, not because I don't think the social is a very important element. I have another paper on Winnicott. You said the baby is a did. I have, where I try to explain the social origins of the mind, okay, of the psychism. So I'm very friendly with the Winnicott approach, that what comes from the social will be relevant constitutive element. I was just less concerned about this in this piece, and you're right, this is something that is missing. But what I use more, it's true that folk psychology is something we develop socially, okay? But I use this folk psychology idea here more with as a technical term that so when we explain our behavior as intentional behavior, so I went to the fridge because I went to drink a glass of water, okay? Mm. So I'm explaining my behavior as caused by my desire of drinking water and my belief that the fridge has fresh water. And then it just explains why I walk to the fridge and get some water. But I could explain, so this is what we call folk psychology explanation. I use terms, vocabulary of psychology. This vocabulary we learn socially, you're right. We learn socially this vocabulary, attribute intentions to the agent. We learn this in our community of speakers, okay? But it just is different if I want to explain my behavior as I'm firing some neurons that is activating my body to walk to the fridge. And if I have a brain injury, I might not be able, even if I want to go to the fridge, I might not be able to, even if I have intention to activate my body in the right way to go to the fridge. So I was trying to and in the regimentation of laws of the causal explanation, the physical explanation, I could explain my behavior as a neuron fired, and this neuron activate some bodily motor actions and make me to go to the fridge. And I could also explain my desire as a neuron that fired in my brain. So this explanation would regimentate some laws. But the folk psychological explanation, I could tell you I'm going to the fridge because I want to drink some water, or maybe I went to the fridge because I have a compulsive behavior to check the fridge before I leave home. And this will be a completely different kind of explanation of why I went to the fridge. Probably the same kind of physical events would happen in the physical level, but in the explanation, in the psychological level, something else is happening in the compulsive behavior, different from, for instance, just a simple desire of going to the fridge and drink water. Okay.
Oh, well, I'll give you another then thought from your paper. It's here. The id is defined both as a reservoir of instinctual energy and as a collection of phylogenetically acquired contents, such as innate fantasies. So then I would add to that, in the same line of thinking I have about the social, that it is the social interaction whereby these things become functional. It's a reservoir, yes, it's a collection, but they become used and functional through social interaction. It needs other people.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that not just needs, yeah, I didn't, this is, in the book version, I discuss more all the Freud pictures, the phylogenesis of those fantasies, and how this might be connected to some past history of our society. So I agree with you that we need not just the social to activate those fantasies, or at least to give those fantasies some expression, but I think also there is all the evolutionary history of humanities that's probably is the expression of the fantasies as related to the past of our as us qua humans. Okay, so there is some past history that I totally agree. I think it's a good observation. What what I would add is the social element does not exhaust probably all the internal contribution of each individual. So you have this universal thing that maybe all individuals in the social interactions have. But there is some singular experience of each individual that those fantasies might express too. So there is some singular element that is my perspective here and now. So I have the past of the humanity, I have my social environment, but I would add in the picture this singular experience of each mind, okay? And this is what we try to do when we do our clinical work, is trying to excavate those fantasies to try to create this linear description or linear thoughts or linear narrative of how this individual is experience those primitive fantasies, or how those primitive experiences develop in some specific individuals. Okay, so I would just like add the singular aspect in the universal and the social elements you brought to the picture that I totally agree, and it's an excellent contribution. Thank you.
I'm very concerned that singularity gets lost in a lot of the psychoanalytic thinking and psychological thinking and so on. I thinking about the social, I wondered if you have any idea about why psychotherapists and analysts are so enamored with neuroscience.
So what?
Enamored with neuroscience. I mean, it feels that there's a kind of slightly desperate, taking refuge in neuroscience, it will save psychoanalysis. Right?
I would say that I have two replies to this. First, a sociological fact. I think we all, as a society, we are enamored with neuroscience. So it becomes like a very powerful force to understand ourselves. And we are fascinated with the brain and all the explanations that I think the neuroscience can give us. Okay, so I think it becomes something very fascinating sociologically. I took part of a project in a contribution with the Max Planck in Berlin, and the project called Brainhood, or cerebral subject, how our contemporary selves, how we start describing us as a brain, and how we became so fascinated with the brain descriptions of ourselves. So I think there is this sociological fact. In the case of psychoanalysis, Freud was a neurologist, so he was also fascinated by the brain. But he had a very limited biological knowledge of the brain at that point. So I think, so psychoanalysts, I think we are attracted to see how Freud's picture of the mind can be conciliated with new discoveries of neuroscience. So I think the challenge is a little bit like, okay, so if Freud was alive, what he would have done with all this knowledge we had nowadays about the brain, would he has created a different kind of theory? Is there any other way to combine his insights about the human mind with this new picture? One thing that I thought, so Thomas Nagel, a philosopher here at the New York University, he has a paper on Freud, a very, I think it's a very old paper on the 70s or 80s, in a collection. And he's trying to, he has an interesting hypothesis. He says, look, Freud was the first to try to attribute some psychological explanation to the brain, try to come with explain the brain in psychological terms. He failed because we know things about the brain nowadays that doesn't match with his explanation, but his was the first to try to create, just to tell us the best way to understand the brain is try to generate some explanations in the level of representation, what neuroscientists are trying to do nowadays in the level of computation. Computation is just explain us how information circulates in the brain, okay? So what he's trying to say, okay, we learn more about the brain if you have a theory that explains how representation, how the brain works with information. We will be more successful if you try to understand how the brain works chemically, the level of the molecule. Probably the level of the molecule. To understand this, we need some kind of extra layer of explanation. But I'm going too far. I'm just bringing lots of elements to the picture. But I think I would explain this as a sociological fact. Psychoanalysts are part of our big community that became fascinated with the brain, for the better and for the worse, because we are not just brains, we are also psychological, we have our psychology. So sometimes the neuroscientific explanation will not give us many tools for understanding our patients. If I know how the brain of the patients work, I might not give me 2 good elements to navigate with all the clinical elements I need. So I need some psychological explanations of what's going on. And psychological theories are still our best guide on this, okay? But our psychology is grounded in our brains. So understand a little bit about the brains, I think, is also part of our jobs. And a psychological theory that is so separated with neuroscience might generate some mistakes. So at least a theory that can be combined with neuroscience might be a more promising theory. Although I totally agree that neuroscience cannot exhaust the understanding of the mind. It makes sense what I said?
Yeah, I mean, I think that point of view is quite representative of a lot of people's opinions. Yeah. But,
what's your view on this?
Well, I feel a bit uncomfortable when a lot of psychotherapists and counselors talk about neuroscience because essentially they don't know anything about it, right? And there are no brain scanning machines in the consulting room to know what's happening. So our tools, as you say, are fundamentally psychological, you know, and quite standard things like fantasy transference, things like that. If we suspect there's something neurological, then we refer people on. Anyway.
Yeah, I think also psychoanalysis was very attacked for not being a science. So I think also this created as the contemporary generation of psychoanalysts. I think also they are trying to connect with neuroscience to give a more to give a certain kind of scientific status to psychoanalysis. Okay, so there is also this attempt to, okay, look how our insights about the mind, or Freudian insights about the mind, are not completely separated from insights we can have about how the neurophysiology of the brain. So I think also there is this attempt to give a more solid scientific status to psychoanalysis. And I think this is also what other kind of psychological theories they have been trying to do. Cognitive behavioral psychology also trying to ground their ideas in a more scientific explanation, to just give some scientific status to the theory. So after having been so attacked by many neuroscientists,
Yeah.
the best paper I read trying to give some interesting explanations is a paper trying to connect why talk with the patient's work. Try to explain this. Why this idea of being in a consultation and talk about your symptoms and what your life, what you're experiencing, why this works with some specific people. We are not talking with your family, your friend. Why this framework that psychoanalysis conducted this in a specific way, but other therapies also have this format. Why this work? Okay. And all this idea of memory, you have to talk about your past, you have to talk about what's going on in your life, but also connection with emotions, why this framework works. Okay? And an attempt to connect this with how our brains work. Why talk about our experiences in our past events or traumatic event, maybe engage a different kind of emotional connection with that past events, might be connected to the way our brains work. So this is an attempt to give a kind of reliable scientific explanation for why psychoanalysis work. I agree with you that this does not help us in the specific clinical work we have to do daily with our patients, but give us as a profession some kind of more reliable status. Okay.
Well, I
Okay,
agree with about status. Yes.
Yeah, but it is a little bit about the sociology of the profession or the sociology of the career.
I just think that, therapy is this kind of disreputable, shameful activity, and people are trying desperately to get away from that. But that's just
good description.
If I could, I just go. Oh, sorry.
no. Who did you want to say something, Barbara?
If you're thinking in terms of folk psychology, then it works this way that we are sitting with the patient and talking. If we were thinking of it in terms of folk psychology, it works because the curse is lifted.
The curse is lifted?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, we're talking folk psychology now.
But what do you mean about the curse?
There would be in folk psychology, there would be the problem that the patient has come in with is a curse. And by talking with the therapist, the way the therapist is talking with the patient, the curse is lifted.
Yeah, I think this is a good way to explain. So I think something happened is in the way we talk with the therapist, but also the kind of questions or punctuations that the therapist make to the way the patient is described, the kind of what elements in the story they are telling that attracts our attention, I think also is relevant. So talking with the therapist, but talking with someone that has we study a lot to talk with the patients, so to understand their story in a kind of a framework, a narrative, and what are the relevant elements. We are constantly surprised that sometimes we are excavating one direction and it appears something completely new in a completely different direction. But I think what attracts our attention is not completely random. I think comes with the way we think the minds are structured. And I think the theory will inform us about how the mind is structured.
Well, maybe the therapist understands what's going on in the curse, by the curse.
Yeah, I agree.
Raymond, you look like
the question which I had, probably an impossible question, yeah. But actually, I'm thinking maybe what Barbara's saying, it kind of points a little bit, maybe, yeah. But I was thinking, maybe I'm asking you to use your imagination. So to thinking, is any way to get beyond, that, seeing things either in terms of neuroscience or in terms of, that kind of. Is there any way of thinking about this in a kind of different way? Does it, maybe it doesn't make very much sense. Yeah. Is there any because
you mean with the patient, or you mean theoretically?
No, I'm not with the patient. Actually, I'm thinking more in terms of to understand, like to understand behavior, whatever, in terms of neuroscience or in terms of psychology. Yeah. So I'm just thinking, is there any way of going beyond that?
Yeah, I could say, yeah, it's a very good question. As you said, maybe impossible, but I'll try to I'll try to tackle this question. So one thing I have in mind, okay, so I have I can describe what's going on in the neurological, as I said, using some neuroscientific explanation. But clinically, this won't help us that much. Psychological, I think, for instance, all the description Freud has in the revised theory of anxiety, it's the last part of the paper, I think is a pretty good one, psychological explanation that we can use a lot when you're trying to understand what's going on with the patients. So what are the events that cause their anxieties, okay? And how what caused the anxiety and what kind of behavior that specific patient usually triggers when they are under specific types of anxieties, okay? But you can also have a description, I think, and we do a lot of this, that is, there's part of our clinical work is about the way the patient describe their phenomenology, their intrinsic experience, what is going on their minds. And this is not captured by the psychological, I don't know, maybe I should say phenomenological conversation, where I talk a little bit about my feelings. And it's true that we are reading that feelings with this psychological framework we have in mind. Oh, the patient is anxious. But anxious is, the patient usually don't say, I'm anxious. Patient usually say, oh, I feel, he comes with their own vocabulary that is much more about a phenomenological explanation of their, or at least description of their experiences. So I think this is the richness of the clinical work. We work with a phenomena that comes with the way the patients describe their narrative. And this cannot be captured by neuroscience, cannot be captured by psychology. I don't know, Freud tells us this in a story with all the elements, lots of imagination to try, as you said. We have to engage a lot in our imagination to understand what kind of experience the patient is going on, almost try to perceive the phenomena from the patient's perspective, kind of quasi-psychotic relationship, like, okay, I'm trying to understand this experience from their perspective and then come back to my perspective. So this is the way I see it. And I agree with you that cannot be captured. It's a level of description that requires, and also I think lots of training to be able to empathically understand what's going on in terms of phenomenological experience of the patient. And this, I'm not talking about this at all in this paper. This paper, I don't have the social element that Barbara pointed. I don't have the phenomenological element that you pointed, Raymond. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. That's very, very interesting answer. Thank you.
It's interesting that it wasn't, I mean, Bion said we don't know what psychoanalysis is. And there's an interesting paper from the 60s by a Scandinavian analyst who said that we have no idea yet what kind of knowledge psychoanalysis is. It doesn't really fit into any of the, different disciplines of knowledge. It's a different kind of knowledge that we haven't yet, hasn't yet found a form, if you like. And I find those ideas very helpful. That still something that's emerging and evolving.
David, what's the name of that? What's the name of that person that you referred to there?
Yeah, I'd need to look it up. I'll send it.
Okay, cheers. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I like it very much, this idea that it's a different kind of knowledge. I think so. My best guess about this is all the discussion about. So one thing is explanations that we can provide. Psychology can provide explanations, and science can provide explanations in different, neuroscience in different levels. there is one level of understanding that usually people think that what we do in an empathic situation, when I try to empathize, we produce a kind of knowledge about the person that is not a psychological or a neuroscientific explanation. Is we engage our feelings and we regulate our feelings according to what we think that person is feeling, okay? And generate a completely different kind of knowledge, okay? And understand of what that specific person is undergoing as an experience. So it requires a lot of introspection. We have to engage of introspection, but it requires a lot of introspection on the side of the patients too, to access what's going on in their minds. Okay. So this is the best I could think about this type of knowledge. But you're right that there are less things, less elaboration in the theory or among psychoanalysts about what kind of knowledge we have been producing psychoanalysis.
Well, thank you for a wonderful evening and your great responses to our questions, and been a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. I love to talk to this group, and the discussion was really rich and interesting, and put me back to things I haven't thought before. I thought that there is one person that has a hand.
Yes,
and I think
that was
he
Leo.
had to left.
He had to go after an hour, so.
I'm happy to reply to any questions anyone have via email. Or any comments or any corrections on my Freudian picture. Anything you think that it needs to be revised. This is talk about psychoanalysis. This was a work of my previous self. I changed a lot my field of work more recently. So,
right.
But it's a pleasure to go back to this discussion and reflect about those questions. And I think that, so I have a professor that was also my supervisor, my clinical supervisor. He used to tell me, I met him and he was my professor at the university, but he kept for many years a seminar in the psychiatric hospital. And I asked him, why you keep your seminar in the psychiatric hospital? He said, the best questions come from the clinicians. Those are people that are seeing patients they have the best questions. If you're not seeing patients, you just forgot how things are.
Well, yeah, I was sorry that Leo didn't ask his question because he's deeply into the roots of Freud's thought. So he would have.
Yeah, please ask him to email me, and I will help to have an email conversation with him.
Okay, and he's from Brazil as well. So.
Oh, interesting. But he is in Essex?
He's at Essex, yeah.
Okay. Oh, please. We have also we share also. We can communicate in Portuguese.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye. Bye.
Bye.